Welcome to Sunflower Movement. I am your host, Ashley Buckner. Before we get started, here's a quick disclaimer. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. I am a licensed therapist, but unless you have a signed consent form with me, I am not your therapist. This platform is not a form of psychotherapy, counseling, or healthcare of any kind. Sunflowers bloom in the most unexpected places, and they adjust to remain connected to the sun. Metaphorically, I define these sunflower movements as experiences with people, places, and moments where we feel seen, heard, and believed. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome back, everyone. I am so excited to introduce today's guest. Her name is Aubrey Stephens. I have been connecting to Aubrey via Instagram for a while, and I really wanted her to come on the podcast because I think Aubrey provides a really special, important space in the post-Mormon community. She is the founder of a group called the Relieved Society, and I'm sure you guys have heard of her if you are on the socials. She's a big post-Mormon community builder, and I'm so excited to have her today. So welcome, Aubrey. So glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to diving into this conversation, and it's a Sunday, so it just feels really
spiritual.
Yes, yeah, like this. If I could. I don't go to church. I haven't gone to church in a very, very long time, but like this is church to me.
This is the way to embody it in a new way. I like it.
Yeah, like a deep, meaningful conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So Aubrey, I think we should probably start with the Relief Society, and maybe that'll intersect. We'll circle back to it as we get into your story. But can you, for the audience, tell us a little bit about why you started it, like how long it's been around, what you offer, all the things?
Yeah. So I started it back in 2023. It'll be 2 years in February, which seems crazy. It's one of those things that feels like it's been around forever, but also at the same time, I can't believe it's almost been 2 years. But I started it at a point in my deconstructing journey where I felt so lonely and felt like, oh my gosh, I've left the church, and you like kind of have that shock of where'd everybody go? Like, I don't have my community. I don't have the Relief Society. I don't have these people I can fall back on like I used to. And I turned to my husband and I was like, we have to move. Like, there's nobody else here who thinks like us. Like, we're the only ones here. And it felt scary and it felt lonely. And then I was actually introduced to the Facebook group, the Faith Journeys group. And it's just from women all over the world who are deconstructing faith. And I realized how many women on there were in Utah and were like, we miss the community. Like, we miss being together and having friends and all this stuff. And I was like, oh, maybe I'm not the only one out here that feels like that. And so I kind of joke about it because it literally was on a whim thing that I did. I was talking to my husband, kind of playing around the idea. I was like, it'd be really funny if we call it the Relieved Society because, we're all relieved and it'd be a funny little pun. He's like, yeah, totally. And it was all like one conversation. I like made up a little graphic and I was like, I should just post it and see what happens. And he's like, yeah, do it. It was like 9 p.m. in February and I posted it. And like, I think we did a pajama party was the first activity. And I posted it there and I posted it in the Faith Journey group. And immediately so many people started RSVPing. And I remember my first thought was like, oh shit, like I have to follow through with this now because people are actually like, yeah, I want to come. But even after I had all these people RSVP, I was so sure no one would come. I was like, well, maybe be 2 people there. And then I can be like, well, I tried, like I did it. I can say I put it out there. And then like 30 women showed up to that first activity.
Wow.
And it was both equally empowering and also sad because it was kind of like, oh, look how many people felt the same way I did. But I was so happy to like create a space for them to be. And yeah, since then it's just grown immensely. We started with like, I think 50 followers and we're at 7,000. And I got people all over the country now that are having activities in their own states. And it's been so cool to watch. So
yeah. I love all of this, and I love how it started and just kind of the spontaneity of it and
Yes.
putting yourself out there. I remember why I started following you because that's one thing I really noticed, especially I'm in Southern Utah, you're in Northern Utah, correct? Where are you at? Where are you
I'm in
located?
Syracuse, which is
Okay.
close to Ogden. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I'm in Cedar City, and there's not a lot of post-Mormon spaces here.
Yeah.
They're hard to come by, and I've been really trying to figure out how do I help people cultivate these spaces, and I that's why I was drawn to your work. I was like, "Oh, okay, there are people doing this, and
Yeah.
how do we build and grow from there?" So I was excited to find your page and offer it as a resource and share, and that's why I'm also so excited to have you on today because one of my hopes for this podcast is to really talk about obviously it's a space for people to come on and tell their stories and authenticity and all of that, but then also to hold space for the healing parts. Like what helps us navigate the really hard things that happen in life, and I think that's exactly what in my opinion, the Relief Society embodies is like there is more out there than what you thought you always knew.
Yeah. And sometimes it's similar to what you've had, but it's just reframed because so many of us leave afraid because we no longer have that community. And we feel like we can't, oh, I can never do this again, or I can never do this again because I don't have that unit. I don't have that organization to do it for me. And I felt like this has been so good for me and for other people to realize that no, you can. You can still have all that. You can have your community. You can have your activities. You can have your campouts. You can have the village to fall back on when something hard happens. You can have all of that. They didn't take that from you. Like that's yours. You can go out and get it anywhere. So
What's coming up for me as you're talking about this is I run into this quite a bit with a lot of different people, but how when you leave high control religion or you leave religion in general, it's like, well, I don't have any morals and I won't have any values and I won't have community. And I really love what you're sharing here because it's like, no, you can create the same community that you had there. And it just gets to be more supportive and a place where everyone gets to belong. And there's not rules that you have to follow in order to be a part of this community. And I think it's a great reframe to really encourage and invite people to sink into that what you had in religion is very possible outside religion. And it's
right.
probably more full. And I mean, correct me if I'm
Yeah,
wrong.
more authentic, I think.
Yes.
That's something I say often to the women is how we talk about like goodness and charity and service, like all these good things that are good morals that we had in the church, but often were done begrudgingly almost because it was your calling or it was, well, I have to get to the right heaven, so I need to make sure I'm doing all of these things. So it may have come from a space that they felt was genuine. Like I know for myself when I served in callings that I was serving, I felt like it was genuine, but there was always that like, but I have to do it. Like that's my calling. I've got to go to heaven, so I got to do it. Whether or not I truly did love that person, the space it came from wasn't necessarily genuine. Um, so now it's just so beautiful to see. Like I do a meal train where if somebody has a baby or is going through a hard time, they can put in that they need meals, and women from all over hop onto that, and they're like, "Yes, I will come. I'll bring you a meal. I've never met you before, but I will show up. I'll bring you a meal." And they have no motive. It's just kindness, and so I feel like you can have that in a more authentic way outside of religion because there is no motive. You're just a good person, and I think it's good for people both to be on the receiving and giving end of that to realize, oh, my goodness didn't come from this. It was me. I'm a good person. So
Yeah, like the goodness is innate within you and it's always been there. And when you strip away like, well, you have to do this in order to go to heaven and you
yeah,
just allow it to be, it's actually more fulfilling and more meaningful because it's coming from within you versus being told that that's something that makes you a good person.
exactly.
I love the meal train. That is so cool.
It's been awesome. It's honestly so gorgeous to see these women. They're just so cool.
Yeah. Oh, incredible. Okay, I want to dive into a little bit more of your story and kind of maybe like the pre-relieved society, if you're comfortable with
Yeah,
that. So can you share a little bit about just your upbringing, where you grew up, talk about your family a little bit? I'll ask you questions along the way.
sure. Okay, so yeah, I was born and raised LDS. I was born in New Jersey actually, and lived in Florida for a while, but we moved to Utah when I was young. So I was raised in Fruit Heights, which is close to Kaysville, Utah, which we kind of make a joke that it's like the Provo of Davis County. Kaysville is. It's like Mormon Mecca there. In fact, we had some missionaries here the other day because I still feed the missionaries. I love them. But they told us that the mission the area that my husband grew up in, Kaysville, is known as the most like Mormon dense mission area in the entire world. I was like, dang, that actually makes a lot of sense considering how I was raised and the people I grew up around. But my upbringing was a little bit unique, even though I was born and raised Mormon. Both my parents are converts, and so
Okay.
I wasn't like pioneer stock Mormon, and so I had a unique perspective on life outside of Mormonism because all of my extended family were not LDS. And I feel like that was a leg up for me a little bit when it came to deconstructing because I didn't live in that same bubble that a lot of people who are pioneer stock, where it's just all you see is Mormon people around you. I had this unique perspective of like, oh, I have all these wonderful relatives who aren't Mormon. Um, and so I think that was kind of a foundation for me when I did start deconstructing to be like, my grandparents are the best people on the universe. Like, how can I believe that they're not going to go to heaven? So
Yeah.
I feel like that being kind of the foundation of my childhood was really helpful when I started to deconstruct. But yeah, I am the youngest of 11, so I'm in your,
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
stereotypical Mormon family.
11. And I'm curious, how old were your parents when they converted? Do you know?
My mom was 16,
Okay.
and she has half siblings on another side, but she was raised with a half brother, um, and she was the only one who converted. So it was her, and then her half brother and her parents, and she was the only one who converted at 16, and I want to say they were in like Minnesota at the time. My grandpa was in the military, so they moved around a lot. But she got involved with missionaries at the time, and so she converted then. And then my dad, it wasn't until after they got married, I'm pretty sure. It was either like when they got married or closely after that he converted. And I think that was why he converted. I was like, in my later years, I look back on that, but I can't say that for sure. But yeah, so he was when he, first got married. Um,
So you're
so
the youngest of 11. Together,
yes,
your parents had 11 kids.
yes,
Wow, your mom is like, I am just, she's a saint.
yes. In fact, so when I was when I was young, because I thought my family was like the ideal Mormon family because I'm like, look at us like multiplying and replenishing the earth. Like we are doing it. And I thought my mom was going to be, you know, raised up to heaven any day because she, without telling too much of her story, but like she had a miscarriage like early on. I think it was like after number 4 or something like that. And it was a late term miscarriage. And she, at the time, was really upset that she was pregnant because she had like 4 babies at home and they were still in diapers and she was exhausted. I had every right to be like, oh my gosh, this is going to be hard. But then ended up losing the baby and she felt so much guilt over that.
Oh, yeah, I
And
can only
so
imagine.
she made a deal with God. She says that she would never question it again. And hence had 11 children. But
Wow.
I was her 6th C-section in a row. And apparently, this is like her favorite story to tell. But um, as a child, again, I thought this was like miraculous. As an adult, I'm like, look, I'm glad I have life and I'm glad I'm here, but also you should not have had me. Because so before me, the doctors were like, you need to stop having children.
Oh, wow.
And she was like, well, it's in God's hands, And so when she had me, It was an emergency C-section. The doctor said my fingernail was sticking out of her womb because that's how thin it was, because her body was like, and we both almost died. Very tragic and traumatic. But that was like, to me, a testimony builder when I was younger. Like,
Oh, for
God
sure.
wanted this big family. We are here to save the world. Like, we are a perfect Mormon family. That was my image of my family growing up. So, but unfortunately, it was actually not the case. I thought that at a young age, but I started getting messaging from people around me that maybe my family wasn't this perfect Mormon family, because I had a brother who got kicked out at 17. I had two siblings who came home early from missions. I had siblings who were divorced. But because of my unique perspective, because my extended family was not Mormon, I didn't have cousins going on missions or, anything like that. That was just normal to me. It was like, oh, that's just life. Like, whatever. I didn't recognize that as something that was making my family not great in other people's eyes. And it started kind of building this core belief in myself that I had to prove that I was good enough, and always appear great, always appear good. And I remember, like, a distinct memory that comes to mind is I was known in our ward as like the girl who always bore her testimony on fast and testimony meeting. And I don't have a memory of like when it started and if it was my idea or if it was my mom's idea, but I do remember at some point my mom starting to like bring me into her bathroom on fast and testimony meetings and being like, so what are you going to say in your testimony today? And she'd be like, well, maybe you should try saying this. And I'd say, okay, sure. So I'd go up and I'd share that. And then it kind of turned into, she would say, hey, I have some stories for you to tell in your testimony today. And then she'd have me rehearse it in the bathroom. And
Interesting.
yes. And so I would get up and then after she'd say, so who stopped you and told you they liked your testimony today? And I'd have to report to her like, oh yeah, this person stopped me and this person stopped me. And I look back on that and realize that was another big foundation for where this idea of I need to appear really good all the time and make the world see me a certain way, to be good enough.
Yeah, it
Um,
sounds like it was really reinforced too. And I'm curious, Aubrey, if you would mind sharing for listeners. I think most people that listen know what fast and testimony meeting is, but could you offer a brief explanation for that?
yes. So in the LDS Church, on Fast Sundays, which is the first Sunday of every month, um, we do a fast, and then instead of just like having speakers, because in the LDS Church, rather than having like a pastor or whatever up and speaking the whole time giving a sermon, it's usually members of the congregation sharing a talk or whatever. But fast and testimony is unique in where anybody can get up, and they definitely got unique. I think every ward had that one person that got up and just like
Yeah, for
everyone's
sure.
butt clenched a little bit, like, oh no. So yeah, it was just an opportunity for anybody to get up and just share their testimony, which is one of those things that if you're reinforcing something and saying it over and over again, that's what creates those core beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because so my husband is like not Mormon, has no idea anything about the Mormon church. He's only ever been to a Mormon baptism, like that's his only experience within Mormonism. And I always joke, I think we just need to go to a fast and testimony meeting. Like I think you just need to go and see it because it really highlights such a foundational element of Mormonism for me that's very unique because there's really no censorship of what gets talked about on there, which I'm not saying there should be,
Yeah.
but it's fascinating. And I think with children looking at it now, and did you watch Secret Lives of Mormon Wives? So when they did the baby blessing and they were bearing their testimonies, it was my first time I had ever really, I had heard it in a long time because I've been out of the Mormon space for a very, very long time. And I was like, oh, this is that brainwashing rehearsal
Mhm.
programming piece.
Absolutely.
where everyone just says the same thing. And I think about it on a nervous system level that literally just gets wired into your being. How can it not? And then what I'm hearing that's really unique about your experience, and maybe it's not really unique, but what's coming up for me is like mom was reinforcing it for you. And you were like, oh my gosh, if I get up there and I say all of these like really special things and everyone's proud of me, like, of course that becomes a core belief for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in childhood, I didn't recognize it, but as an adult and like looking back on my life, I do recognize how I may not have seen my family in the light that the ward did, or the group that we all went to church with. But my mom did, and she definitely felt it. And so
Oh,
as
yeah.
as much as like I know she did the best with the tools she had, she was definitely worried about that appearance and wanted to like project that through me. And I was used as I got volunteered to sing all the time too. It was always, ward things, stake things, firesides, homecomings that were in different wards. Like she was always volunteering me to do that. And I recognized that she had those same core beliefs, like those same concerns of like not appearing righteous or not appearing perfect, because our family was not, and whose is,
Yeah.
But definitely Mormonism creates that goal of wanting to appear perfect. And I think I was maybe her last hope. And so I got pushed onto that and used in that way. And so I hold a lot of empathy for her in that, especially as an adult now, recognizing that like I'm having to deconstruct that very belief, and she was doing it for a lot longer, and that's got to be exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah. Very exhausting. And I think what's also coming up for me as you're talking too is you really, and I think about this all the time and with the clients I work with and people I talk to, it's like most people as children don't understand what's happening in like this religious space, in this religious setting, which makes sense. But then as an adult, it's like the connections and the insights and what was happening all really come to the surface. And I think that's what's, to me, some of the more worrisome parts about high control religion culture is that we do not know how it's going to affect kids, and we're really probably not going to know until they're adults.
Right. Yes, exactly. And I'm definitely in the unraveling. I've been pulling on the string for quite a few years now, and I'm starting to make a lot of connections that come back to those core beliefs that I'm realizing were not necessarily good core beliefs. There are some that I'm like, I can work with this. I can work around that. But there are definitely a lot of my fears and my anxieties and my feelings of shortcoming. I pull on that string, and I can find it in childhood, oftentimes related to religious, upbringing. There's one big key moment in my story that I find at the end of that string in a lot of things. When I was in junior high, I was just almost 13. My oldest brother took his life.
Oh,
And it was hard as it was. Back then, suicide and even mental health in general was still so very taboo. And so my family, which was already kind of looked down upon for things, suddenly became like, ooh, like what's going on? And like we were being looked at under a microscope. But what happened for me, and like what really kind of changed and really set in stone a core belief for me, was shortly after that, my oldest sister, and again, I don't hold this against her because again, she was doing what she could with the tools she had. But she had a dream where my brother came and visited her in this dream to give her a message. And so she invited the entire family to come over and we could talk about this dream. And she tells us that he came to her to tell her that he would be ready for his temple work, which I don't know if it's changed, but back then, when somebody passed away, you have to wait a year before they can do their temple work. And he wasn't endowed. And so he was coming to tell her that when that year was up, he would be ready because he was doing the work on the other side. But then in addition to that, he had a personal message for each of his siblings. Now that's 10 of us. And he is going.
and your wow, and your sister was giving them all to you.
Yeah. Well, she wasn't telling us what the message was, but just that he had something really important for each of us to know.
Okay. Okay.
And so he's going to each sibling individually. And there were three of us that couldn't or wouldn't hear him. And he's shaking and he's crying and he's trying so hard to give us this message, but we're just not listening. And I was one of those siblings.
Mm.
I was 13. So I remember I actually talked with this or about this with my older sister recently. And she was like, oh yeah, I was one of them too. But I walked her out of there going like, okay, whatever. And I said, well, that is lucky for you because you were an adult in that situation. You were
Yeah.
able to walk away and
Yeah.
say, oh, that doesn't serve me. No, thanks. But I was 13 and I took that so literally. And so every choice I made, which like 13 already is such a vulnerable age.
Oh my gosh. It is the most, I say this all
It's
the time. It is the most vulnerable age. And then you're going to throw in a huge trauma in your family. You're going to throw in this dream. You're going to throw in high control religion in general. It's just a clusterfuck if you
it was.
excuse my French.
It was. And so everything that happened up to that, even if it was minute, I would bring it back to that dream and be like, well, no wonder you screwed this up. Like, this is why you can't hear him because you're such an idiot. Like, you're making bad choices. And it was like minor bad choices, but minor bad choices to me were like, oh, I'm a terrible person. And this is why I can't hear him. This is why my family's not going to be all together forever. And it's my fault because I can't hear him. And I carried that for a long time, this belief that I was never good enough. And I heard that message repeated to me in things like Young Women's and school, because I've always been very just like obnoxious, and I love to make people laugh. I love to be silly and I love to play. But like that was not becoming of a young woman who was like preparing for the temple, And so I was always getting shut down by leaders and by bishops and teachers telling me like young women shouldn't behave like that. Like young women shouldn't be trying to make people laugh. Like you should be more meek and more humble and more quiet and more docile, all these things. And all the while the men and our activities or the boys are behaving that way. Where again, between me and my next oldest sister, there are 4 boys. And so I was essentially raised with 4 brothers. And so I just was used to like wrestling with the boys and so it was weird for me to be in a setting where I was with all the women and the boys are all over here. And I'm like, they're telling me you can't have fun and play like the boys. You've got to be a woman. You've got to sit down and cross your ankles, and so, yeah.
No, I mean, what's coming up for me is this is maybe a little extreme, but it's giving me like keep sweet. And what is that?
Pray and obey.
Yeah, pray and obey. That's the vibes that I'm getting right now. And I think I've maybe thought that, but this is really correlating that for me.
Yes. I feel, in fact, I'll get to that, but that was a huge part of my deconstruction was that show. Yes.
Okay, we'll go back. Okay, interesting that it's coming up because that's like what I'm, and you're at this age where you're still so curious and open and like you're still a kid, and then I guess I haven't really thought about like the impact young women's has on normal age appropriate development.
Right. And kind of taking that away from you and taking it out of you, because by the time you're 12, which now it's 11, which is even more horrifying.
Oof.
I know, but they're telling you like to learn how to keep house and how to make meals and how to raise children. And so again, my timeline was I had this traumatic thing happen, and then I was in my mind believed that it was my sole duty to keep my family together forever, because if I didn't do it, it was going to fall apart and it would be all my fault. And then you add in the young women messaging that I'm getting of like, you're too much, you're not good enough, sit down, be quiet, that definitely was beaten out of me very quickly. And anytime it would creep up, it was like I would have so much guilt over it for just being a child, for being a kid, And it was one of those, I would hear all the time how mature I was and how I was such a lady, because it was that dialogue got switched and I was like, oh, this is the good dialogue. This is what I'm looking for. This is what I'm supposed to achieve. And so I really leaned into that. But again, I am who I am. I like being fun. I like being silly. And so I would slip up. I would be, I say slip up, but I would be
Yeah.
normal, you know? But to me, it was such a hard, it was so hard for me. And I remember when I graduated, they just barely changed the age for missionaries. And because I was still stuck in this belief that I just didn't fit, no matter how hard I tried, I did not want to go on a mission. Not even kind of. It was never on my radar. But I wanted to prove to everyone that I was good enough, because I was getting messaging from family, and that I wasn't, that I was this bad person, and I already believed all those things. So hearing them come from these sources was like just reaffirming that belief that I wasn't good enough. And so I said, well, okay, I'll go on a mission. That will definitely fix me, and it'll prove that like I'm so good. Um, and my mission was very traumatic. But I'm also so grateful that I went, because I consider my mission the turning point for me, where I started seeing things in a different light. It took me years after to finally leave, like to have the courage to leave. But I do trace it back to the things that I learned on my mission. Because I went to the Philippines, and
Wow.
yes, which is just jarring for a little 19-year-old girl from Utah, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and also too, I think one thing what's coming up for me a lot and thinking about your story is like you had this really big trauma that happened in your family, right? And in your life. And and then you like any of us, when we have a big distress, we find something that seems to make it better, like following all the rules, being really good. But then the problem was that actually, like, this authentic part of you, this silly, fun, anytime you, I mean, you use the word slip up, like it became this shame-based part of you in a lot of ways. And it's so interesting too, because I think like that part of you probably would have been the part that was the most healing and the most supportive for the distress that you were feeling, but you were in a part of an environment that was like, no, we don't get to be her. And it's really interesting too, because I think it shows how our environment impacts the traumas that we have and the
Mhm.
distress we experience. And if our environment is supportive to that distress and allows us to be authentic and allows us to grieve and talk about all of these things, that then the distress doesn't get stuck, you
Right.
know? But then here you are, you like spent your entire adolescence and you didn't even want to go on a mission, but you're like, I'm going to go. I'm going to prove everyone that I can do this. Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's, I mean,
Yeah.
that's there's a lot of pieces there, and I just really, your vulnerability, I think, is powerful too. So tell me, like, so you went to the
I
Philippines.
did.
What were the traumatic parts?
Okay, so starting like week one, actually I think it was the first day. Um, I am like pumped because I am something that my mom always told me was like, she used to say the phrase like, I should have named you Joy, because I was always positive. I was always like happy and cheerful. That was definitely a surface thing. I was very much a shove every other bad emotion down, because like those are bad and I need to always be happy and I need to be cheerful. There's definitely a part of me that is that. Um, and it's taken me a long time to realize that those things can both exist. I can be a joyful, positive, happy person and have negative emotions. Um, but I was so optimistic going into my mission. I was like, I am going to just be the best missionary, and I am going to love everyone. I'm going to just do all the things right. And that crashed and burned within the first week, because we had this investigator who lived quite literally in a cardboard box. And her kids didn't have food, they didn't have clothes. Um, and she was so interested in joining the church, because like we would bring her food and things like that. And I remember in that first week, my companion said that we needed to drop her. Like we needed to drop her as an investigator. We couldn't keep going to see her. And I was so confused, because they said she wants to be baptized. And she said, well, yeah, she only wants to be baptized for the humanitarian need, like the humanitarian part of the church. And I was so confused because, but what's wrong with that? Like, isn't that what charity is? Isn't that what Christ-like love is? Would Christ say, sorry, you're too poor and you only want to follow me because I will help you and feed you? Like, that felt so wrong to me right off the bat. And I was kind of combative with my companion about it because I just did not understand. I said, we're wearing the name of Christ. Aren't we supposed to be representing Christ? I don't feel like Christ would say, no, sorry. But I got overruled because it was a mission rule. It was a
Ooh.
mission. Sorry. Oh, did you? Sorry.
Well, I'm just like taking it in because wow, this is heavy.
Yeah. And so that was rough. It kind of like dampened my spirit, but I was like, okay, well, it's a mission rule and I've got to follow the rules. I got to be able to hear my brother. Like, I got to follow the rules. Exactly. But it still always kind of just like that sinking feeling in my heart. Like when I would be on that same street, my heart would hurt. And we had another investigator. Well, she wasn't an investigator. She was actually a inactive member, because one of my main focuses of my mission was to reenact the inactive, because it's very common in the Philippines for them to join the church and then disappear. Especially in my mission, I was in Manila, which is like the city hub. People would come in from the provinces for work and then they go back. And so they come in and they meet these, white Americans and are like, oh, sweet, I'll join your church. And then realize that comes with a cost. And then they just kind of ghost them. But there are a few locals to the city. And this woman, we would go visit her all the time, trying to get her to come back to church. And when I learned her story, I again was just so shocked that this was the same church I thought I was a member of, because she was the Relief Society president, and I want to say her husband passed away. I can't remember if he passed away or they got a divorce or something like that. So she no longer had a husband who was working, and so she lost income and had children to feed. In fact, she had grandchildren living with her, so they were helping to support all these children in the house. And so she couldn't pay tithing. And so they took away her temple recommend and released her from her calling. And she was mortified and she was so embarrassed. And I was so confused. At first I thought it was a language thing. So I asked my companion, I was like, is this really what she's saying? And she said, oh yeah, she couldn't pay her tithing, but we're trying to teach her, our focus with her should be tithing and the importance of tithing. And I felt so wrong about that. How can we come into her house, which again was just plywood? How can we come in here and tell her she needs to pay her tithing? This woman clearly needs love. She needs support. She needs help. She does not need to pay to play,
Wow. I mean, I'm having so many things come up
I'm
right
sure.
now, so you might have to rein me in. I almost get the sense that there's this part of missionary work that I've never thought of is to get people to pay money to the church. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating too. And for those who aren't familiar with the Mormon church and the standards to have what's called a temple recommend, you have to pay 10% of your income. And if you don't pay 10% of your income, you don't get a temple recommend. And the temple is where you get to go to the highest level of heaven and all of these things. And so it's fascinating to hear about this in this particular country, and that the church is no longer going to support this woman because she can't pay 10%, which obviously she shouldn't be paying 10% at all.
Right.
It's very fascinating.
It is. And it's very common. We had a lot of people like that. Most of the investigators that I spoke to, it was always, they would come back to, I can't afford it. And that always sat so weird with me. You can't afford it. It's your salvation. Why are you having to pay for it in the first place? Isn't that what the church funds are for? I was really confused about all of that, because the way I thought the church worked in my little bubble in Utah, I thought that my tithing was helping that. I thought that's why I was paying tithing, to help people who couldn't. Oh. And, I thought that that's what was happening. On my mission, I learned that your tithing only goes to like your area or your fast offerings, I guess. So like in the Philippines, if they're not getting funds from their ward or stake or whatever in the fast offerings, they don't have money to help people in the ward. So this $200 billion corporation is not
Yeah.
spending money to help these communities. They're
That
building
that's
temples.
what's coming up that's what's coming up for me as you're talking right now. I'm like, you're telling me that we know the wealth of the LDS Church. It's common knowledge, right, in the present day, and they're not sending money to these communities.
No, they send money to build the temple, and you also have to meet a certain like financial goal and a membership goal in order to build a temple. And so there is this big push to get people to pay tithing and to get people converted so that they can build more temples, which then most of them can't go into anyway because they can't afford it.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm so curious, Aubrey, like, what are your how did this shape you and your like perception of tithing and just all of it? I mean, obviously it sounds like to me this was probably the precursor to then what ended up happening later on, but how did you navigate this while you were out there doing it?
I think it was a lot of just shoving things down and like putting it on the shelf, as they say, because I'm being told this is that you're acting as Christ and this is what Christ would do. And that my inner self was like battling that. Like, I don't feel like the Christ I learned about would be doing this. In fact, he repeatedly like called money the devil and was like telling people to get rid of their riches. Like, that's not important. Just like love each other. And I made that argument a lot. There was a part of me that was trying to put it on my shelf, and then there was also my combative, like spicy side, who was kind of being like, this does not make sense. And I would kind of do that in our companionship meetings or whatever, where they would say, we need to drop this person. And I'd say, Jesus wouldn't drop this person. I don't understand. Like, I, it was, I was torn, I think, at the
Yeah.
time. I think there was a part of me that, because I still lived in that fear of not being good enough and wanting to do it exactly right, I continued to do it exactly right. But there was a point in my mission, I don't exactly know. I know I started fraying a little bit, and all of these experiences of asking people for money and having to drop them, that kind of frayed on my rope a little bit. And I think there was a moment that I kind of snapped. That rope did snap on my mission, and it was because we had this investor. He was so awesome. He was 18 and he was a squatter. So he lived in a province, and then he would come into the city for work, and then he would take a bus all the way out to his province, which I think was like a 6-hour bus drive, to drop money off for his mom and his sisters, and then he would drive back. And he did that on Sundays because that was the only day he didn't work. And so, but he was so excited. He was so excited to join the church. He just thought it was so cool. He loved the Book of Mormon, weirdly enough. Like, he loved the Alma chapters, all about the war and stuff. He thought it was so cool. And he would always bring new friends every time we went to see him. And he lived in a squatter home, which was literally just a broken building that they used. When you walked into the building, it was just a collapsed building. And they used that like a corner for their shower and then a quarter for like the bathroom. But then you would go up these cement steps to the roof of the building next door, and that's where they slept. And they would just sleep like under tarps or just out under the stars. And there were probably like 30 men that lived here. And he started coming to church with us, but he would have to leave. This was back when church was still 3 hours. And so he would have to leave after whatever the second class was. I think it was Sunday school, in order to make the last bus that would take him out to his province, and so that he could be back in time to work for the next morning. So he took the very last one, and he was sacrificing that whole day of being able to spend time with his family to come to church with us. And this sweet, sweet boy, because when you are going to get baptized, you have to go through an interview. But if you have committed what they consider a serious sin, you have to have your interview with the mission president. And he had a girlfriend who had had an abortion. And so when he was ready to be baptized, we had to go to the mission president. And the mission president's giving him this interview, and he gets to the part where he talks about the abortion. And this sweet kid, he's just sobbing because he's like, I didn't know my girlfriend was pregnant. She told me after that she had been pregnant and got an abortion. And I was really sad because I really wanted, like, I would have loved that baby, you know, all this stuff. So he's reliving this traumatic thing that was hard for him in front of this white American dude with me and my companion there because we're having to translate. And the bishop or the mission president kind of says, okay, like, you seem repentant of that. That's a whole nother thing. But he's like, let's carry on with the interview. And he gets to the part where he says, do you attend all your meetings? And he says, well, yes. But then he explains how he has to leave after the second one in order to get back to his family and back in time. And the audacity of this rich white man looks at this little boy and says, if you were truly repentant and truly converted to Christ, you would sacrifice anything. And you need to be at your meetings before you can be baptized. And I snapped at the mission president. I was like, what do you know of sacrifice? Like, do you hear him? Like, he's literally living on a rooftop in the middle of a city away from his family. I kind of like, and my companion had to like pull me out of there because I was like, this does not make sense to me. And he's just crying. Yeah. We never saw this kid again.
This was horrific.
It was horrible. I never saw that kid again. He never wanted to see us. He was so embarrassed. And of course, he just went and bore all these things to this man he didn't know because he was so ready. And he was told no because he didn't go to his priesthood meeting, which ended up being moot anyway because they changed the rules and now it's only 2 hours anyway.
I mean, I guess what's coming up for me, Aubrey, and I didn't realize this, and now as I'm thinking about it, I guess you do have an interview with the bishop before you get baptized at 8, correct?
Yes.
That's something that happens. And so then that's what's happening on missions.
Yes.
And I what I'm thinking too is obviously when you grow up in the church and you're like your little 8-year-old self, you're probably not going to have some of the life experiences and quote unquote sins that people that are being converted to Mormonism that are all different ages have. Right. So they're asked particular questions or they're held to a particular standard in order to even be able to be baptized.
Mm-hmm. And typically they just do that interview with the district leader who's a 19-year-old kid. And a lot of times these are adults being baptized and you have a 19-year-old telling you if you are or not worthy enough.
I guess I didn't realize that it's all coming up for me, but there is like this standard of being worthy enough to be baptized into this church. If that's not a red flag, I don't know what it is.
And I think that snapped for me because it pulled on that like feeling of not being good enough, of like not being worthy. And I saw this kid as somebody who was literally sacrificing everything because he was to be at church and to join the church. And he was paying tithing when, you know, all of his money was going to his family, but he was paying, he was doing everything. And so if this mission president is looking at him and telling him, you're not good enough, then that was personal for me. You know, it was like, oh, okay, well, I'm never going to be able to meet this standard and I'll always be the sibling that can't hear my brother. You know, that's where my mind always went back to.
Yeah.
And I think that's what kind of made that snap for me. But I think what on a more kind of positive note for my mission, like something that helped unravel for me was I met this woman. She was a priestess and she was so cool, but she loved talking with us. She lived alone, so she was really lonely. So we would go and like do her dishes and chat with her. And anytime she saw us coming, she would run outside because in the Philippines, you have the streets and almost every house has what's called a tindahan store on the outside. And it's people selling things outside of their house. So she'd run to the nearest tindahan to get like a loaf of bread or a sweet roll or something so she could feed us. She just loved us. And she loved talking with us. And I remember she asked us, she said, why don't you guys worship Mary? Like, I just think that's so weird. And from my understanding at a 19-year-old, I said, well, we don't worship idols and we consider anything that's not God and Jesus as an idol, you know. And she shared with me like what was her testimony of Mary. And she shared about how Mary brought Christ into the world. She had this huge mission. Like, she was ridiculed. And if you believe in the story of Christ and how he came into the world, like, you would have to believe that Mary was a chosen, incredible person and that she went through a really hard time from giving birth to him to raising him and then to watching him be crucified, right? That was a huge burden for her. And so in her eyes, she was like, why wouldn't they exalt her? Of course they would exalt her for that mission. And I was like, that is so cool. I love that idea.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling what we talk about being the Spirit, which was that like warm, burning bosom feeling while she's bearing her testimony and she's like crying. And I was like, wow, that was really powerful. And I was so excited to talk about it with my companion at the end of the day. And she said, oh, we need to drop her. She's not gonna progress. I was like, but she loves us. She loves when we come over. We're being Christ-like, right? We're visiting the widow. She's lonely. She's sad. But no, we had to drop her, which was heartbreaking. But I am so grateful for that lesson that she taught me, because in my deconstructing later on, I would pull from that memory of, I remember feeling the Spirit and feeling goodness. That meant that the church did not have a monopoly on that. That didn't belong to this organization. That goodness, that good feeling can come from anywhere. And that was a powerful lesson for me on my mission. So
yeah, that is really impactful. I kind of got like the chills when you were talking about it. And you kind of had mentioned this, like you obviously experienced and endured a lot of trauma and witnessed a lot of really hard things, in my opinion, on your mission. But you had also said at the beginning, like you're also so grateful you went.
yeah, I was there during the really big typhoon that happened in 2013. I don't know if people remember that. It was world news. It was huge, devastating. And after that, I went out because, they just send you out and the floods are knee deep. And I had a mosquito bite on my ankle. And I went through these, the flooded streets, which the streets are not clean in the slightest there. And I got really, really sick. They kept telling me it was like a mosquito-borne disease. And because I was so determined to be good enough and to prove my worth, I was so sick, but I would still go out every day. And I'm like sweating buckets. And I would legitimately faint while I'm out in the streets. But I was like, if I'm righteous enough and I'm good enough, like God will heal me, because I got so many blessings that said that. And so I said, okay, I'm going to be exactly obedient. I'm going to do exactly what I'm supposed to. I'm going to heal. I'm just going to keep working. Well, I didn't. And just progressively got more and more sick until they finally sent me home thinking I had rheumatoid arthritis because my joints were all really swollen. I was really feverish. But when I got home, I went to the ER because my throat was closing. And it turned out I was going into septic shock because
Oh my gosh.
because I had gotten an infection in that leg. And so I have, again, in my mind at the time, I looked at that not as negligence from the mission doctors, which one of them gave me sleeping pills during all of this because he told me I was just really tired and needed to sleep. I was just stressed. I didn't look at it that way. I looked at it as I didn't do something right. Like, I wasn't worthy enough. I wasn't good enough. Here I am again. I've done it again. I still can't hear him because I'm not doing everything the right way. And so it took a while for me to kind of shake that. But when I got home, my husband and we had dated before I left, and we got married like within the year of me coming home. And we got married in the temple, did all the right things, which is funny because we talk about it now that we look back on that, and neither of us really wanted to. We both were already kind of starting to unravel, but we couldn't admit it because it's scary, especially.
It's terrifying. It is so terrifying. And I really want to, I want to say that. I think it's so important to say, because people are always like, well, why would you do that? Why don't you just leave? Why don't you just walk away? A lot of outsiders. And with working with so many people and understanding the way religion and religious trauma gets into your being, it is easier to get married in the temple than it is to say, hey, I don't think I can do that. Like it just is. It's an act of survival, in my opinion, because you don't have to, if you say you're not getting married in the temple, the layers that you have to unpack, and the layers you have to unpack within yourself, not to mention your family. I mean, it's
a
hard.
lot, yeah.
It's not easy. It's not easy to do this.
Right. So, when we got married, we held the typical newlywed callings. We were in primary. We were in primary most of the time. But right up before, so when we had our second child, both of us kind of we weren't telling the other, but we could kind of tell that we were kind of done because we were mostly inactive. I was teaching young women's at the time, but I would only go to teach young women's and then I would come home. But I had this felt like I had a duty to protect those girls, so I was the very outspoken leader and wanted to protect them and let them know they were safe. But it came to the point where my daughter needed to get blessed and we kind of were like, do we want to do that? I don't know. And so we tried to see if we could do it at home, but the bishop wouldn't let us. And, which is so weird.
Yeah, because everyone does. I mean, as we saw in Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, everyone's blessing at home. Okay.
Because now it's fine. But at the time it was not fine. It had to be in a church. And so we did it on a Sunday evening in the cultural hall. Because we had, our families we are so big and everybody had different things going on and that we couldn't just do it in sacrament meeting. And so he did let us do it later, but it had to be in the building, which is so weird. But after that was when 2020 happened. And so everyone was home. And I think for a lot of, at least the women I've spoken to in Relieved Society, that was the out for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. I remember shortly after that time, I never really looked into church history or anything like that. That was not my unraveling. My unraveling had very much to do with my own feelings. But I remember I watched the documentary Murder Among the Mormons. I don't know if you watched that one.
Yep, I've seen that one.
With the salamander letter. And I remember it made me so angry. And I came out to my husband and I was like, the thing that bothers me about this the most is that it doesn't surprise me. It does not surprise me that the church paid so much money to try and get a hold of this document because they probably wanted to hide it. And this was before I knew anything about hidden church history. I just was not shocked because of what I'd witnessed on my mission and what my own emotions surrounding things just policies in the church. I was like, this doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me at all. But then we moved into a new home and I thought, it was that fear of not having community that I was like, we should go to church to try to meet people. We went twice and we were like, no, this feels icky.
And this was after, so COVID, you had been home and then you moved and then you went to church.
Yes.
And then you were icky feeling.
Yes, because we bought our house at the end of 2020. And so church just started kind of opening up again right there at the end or at the beginning of 2021. And so we were like, well, it's going to be hard to meet people. We should probably go to church and try and meet some people. And we realized those weren't the people we wanted to meet, unfortunately. And so we just kind of didn't go. We did hold a calling. We were the, what do they call it? Activity day leaders, which was just a week calling, and we would play kickball with the boys. It wasn't anything like that. But we, I watched Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey. And that was my absolute undoing. I was pregnant with my third and I watched it and so many things came up for me while watching it. But I think what the main point was at the end, the women that were still actively practicing are up there bearing their testimony about how they just know it's true and how they have just felt it. And it's been such a blessing and all these things in their life. And it clicked for me. And I went to my husband and I said, I'm done, because that was the point that I think was building for me for a long time, which was that truth does not belong to the Mormon church. Truth is everywhere. Truth is where you find it. And these women, who am I to tell them, no, your burning in the bosom, your spiritual experience, your truth is wrong because it's not mine. Even though you received it the same way I received mine.
Yes.
Yours is wrong and mine is right. And it brought me back to that woman on my mission where I was like, I felt the Spirit so strong with her. It was one of the most spiritual experiences on my mission because she was so passionate and felt so strongly about this. And it also made me kind of emotional because I was like, well, yeah, God does love women. You know, he is going to exalt a woman.
Absolutely.
That was not something that had ever occurred to me before. And so I started unraveling in that way where I just was like, nobody has a complete truth. Nobody does. And to say that you do is very ignorant, to assume that your truth is the only truth and it's the right truth when somebody else has the exact same experiences with their truth, with their spiritual experiences. And thankfully, I was one of the lucky ones that when I told my husband, I said, I'm done. I can't raise my kids in this, because I had such issues with gay rights and with, feminism within the church, equality, modesty has always been something that bothered me. So I had all these issues with the current church. And so when I told him I want to be done, he was like, hallelujah. I was like, really?
Yeah.
The truth was he never wanted to do any of that. He did that because he thought I wanted it, And so it was a beautiful moment in our marriage to realize, like, oh, we were doing this thing for each other, but we didn't have to. We don't have to. And so
wow.
yes.
No, I love, this is really, there's so much coming up for me. And I think I love what you share. Like, it wasn't for you, it was the feelings that was also for me too. I was very young. I was like 20, but that was that was why I wasn't a member of the church. To be honest, I haven't really even dove into like the hidden church history. I mean, I'm like 16 years out of it, but I just, I knew that I didn't belong to it because of the things that I felt. And I think that what happened in 2020 that was really unique was that everyone stopped going to church. And so what happens is your nervous system gets to chill out and just be, and not be in the environment that's creating all the distress and dysregulation that most members of the church have no idea. People haven't made those connections too. And I don't know if they ever would have prior to 2020, And so it's like, then 2020 happens, everyone stops going. And then your story too, you're like, and then we go back and it's icky. It feels icky. And that's what happens, right? When you like step out of an environment and you step out of the environment for such a substantial amount of time, your body gets to chill and then it goes back and it's like red flag, red flag, red flag.
And
it
feels so normal before.
So normal before. Why wouldn't it? And I mean, I think it has to feel normal. To me, staying, and just like we talked about earlier, staying and going and like it feeling normal is a trauma response.
Absolutely.
Because it's far too distressing to think about not going.
Right.
But that was the gift of 2020 for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Is they didn't have to go anymore.
Right. And that felt so right.
Of COVID. I'm calling it 2020. I don't know.
I think we all know.
but that was the gift of COVID, right? Is that everyone was able to stop going.
Right. I agree with that completely. Yeah. And I think for me, prior to that moment, on top of just like the icky feelings that I had, I always had that fear of leaving, no matter how much I maybe wanted to. I had the fear that if I did, I was accepting that I was the person that couldn't hear him, and it was intentional. It was I wouldn't hear him, not that I couldn't. And even though I now look at that and say, that was her dream, and I'm so glad she can pull something from that, does not serve me. It never had to. And, I have to apologize to my 13-year-old self often to say, I'm sorry, that didn't serve you. You didn't need that.
Yeah.
But I had that fear of, on top of the plan of salvation, right? Like, if I leave, maybe what if it's true and I'm really never going to see my brother again or whatever. But the beautiful thing about that was letting go of fear, because fear is so debilitating. And that's how the church was run. It's run through fear. And I realized if I'm staying based on fear, I don't want to live my life that way. I don't want to live a certain way because I'm afraid. I'd so much rather live led by light and led by goodness and led by my own heart and my own morality. Because if there truly is a being that is puppeteering everything and watching how this plays out, and if we do good, we get to heaven, then that being is not going to keep me from seeing my brother in the eternities if that is a real thing. And I realized that I felt so much more peace with that belief than I did with this belief of, well, if I don't do it right 100% of the time and still live in it, I'm still not going to see him no matter how I try, because I can't do it right. I've never been able to just stay and do it right. And so releasing that fear was such a gift to myself, to let my life be led by love and not fear.
Thank you for sharing all of that.
Yeah.
I love that your husband and you both like had this beautiful moment together. And I'm really curious, what else has been supportive for you since you've stepped away? So you would have stepped away like the end of 2020?
Yeah.
2021,
yeah.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about like what's been helpful, what's been healing. Obviously, I think you're probably still deconstructing.
We will be, yes.
I think that I like to say this too. Like, I don't know. I mean, like I said, I haven't been really affiliated with Mormonism for 16 years, and I feel like there's still layers that are still in my being, because that's just what happens.
Right.
So yeah, what's been supportive and healing for you on your journey?
I love that. I actually have made shirts that say healing, not healed on them.
Oh, love it. I need one.
Because I feel like that is what I've just embodied in general, is just that it is a journey. And sometimes I find myself being like, oh, I thought I got over that, but find myself triggered. And then I have to realize that it's not that Mormon mindset of like, stay on the straight and narrow and then you get the reward. Because I think that a lot of we work in that way. Like, it's do this and then you get the reward. And I had to release that mindset of it being a finish line, because there is no finish line with healing. You're not ever going to be fully healed. It's always going to be healing. And in regards to Mormonism, like what that looked like for me was embracing spirituality in new ways and recognizing when I do feel that still small voice or that spirit or the warm burning, I stop and I recognize it, and I recognize it for what it is. And I feel it at a emo punk rock concert, I feel it when I'm out in nature. I feel it when I'm with my family. I feel it drinking with the girls, something that I never thought, like you're told the spirit gets driven away when you do things you're not supposed to. Right. And I feel it in these moments that I'm not supposed to. And I stop and I recognize it. And I allow myself to just feel it, because, and recognize that feeling's coming from me. It's not coming from an outside source. And it can be hard to recognize it sometimes, but that's been like a big focus for me, is like recognizing the good, recognizing the feelings that I was always told are coming from the spirit or whatever, and just letting them be and just feeling them. Because I remember feeling it as a member of the church was almost scary, because it was like, oh no, is this the spirit or is this me? Like, where is this? Is this the devil? Like, where is this thought coming from, or where is this feeling coming from? And now kind of leaning into this, just embracing spirituality everywhere, no matter where it comes from, and just letting that be, just letting it be, has been really healing for me.
What's coming up for me is I'm thinking about what you shared earlier about like you 13-year-old you, right? And going into Young Women's and being told to be this certain way, but then there was like this other part of you that would slip up. And it's almost like you're really honoring her and holding her, and like that authentic piece of you is actually what is your spirituality.
Yes. And I do notice that, where especially in parenting, because I'm my kids tell me I'm bananas all the time, because I'm loud and I'm cuckoo and I'm crazy and I embarrass the hell out of them all the time. But that's who I am, and they love it and they embrace it. And so do I. Like, I realize that this is who I am and I love it. So being who I am, and allowing myself to be who I am, and recognizing that I'm not just one face, like there are lots of parts of me, and embracing whoever shows up that day and just embracing her as she shows up. And that's how I became authentic, is just recognizing that, oh, I am joy. I am positivity, but also sometimes I'm a pessimist, and sometimes I'm pissed off, and sometimes I'm really annoyed. Sometimes I'm silly, sometimes I'm serious. Like, I am a whole rounded person, and I don't have to just be the one that is going to keep me on this path. I can be whoever I need to be and whoever I show
Yes.
up as that day. Um, and I mean, I credit a lot of that to different kinds of therapies. I've tried a lot of different avenues, and I encourage everyone to find the avenues that work for them. Um, and I think there's also this stress because, again, we're taught that the world is black and white, and there's like one direction always, that sometimes we're afraid we're going to choose the wrong one. And letting go of that mindset of just like, try all of the things, do all of the things, and like find the one that makes you feel good, that brings you that feeling, feel and sit in that feeling. I've tried a lot of different things. And as far as spirituality goes too, like, be open to things. My one of my favorite sayings is, I believe everything and nothing. Is just, I'm open to whatever, like whatever, but I don't believe in complete truth. And so I just accept what feels good, both in spirituality and in healing. So
I love that. I love what you said too, that there isn't one right way to do this. And there isn't one right therapy out there, and there's not one right way to embody spirituality. And I think that right or wrong is such a big consequence of high control religion culture. And that's how we, for a lot of people, that's how you navigate the distress of like it being black or white. And really, the world is so gray and healing is so gray. And you're probably going to fall down like 10 times before you figure out the pathway that actually makes sense for you. And then you're going to go on that pathway for a while, and then it's not going to work anymore, and you're going to have to pivot. Right. And so it's just really being open to that. And I think you really embodied that in that share. I want to talk a little bit about Relief Society in terms of how that's been like supportive for you, and then also how do people access it? Like how if listeners are interested in being a part of it, how do they go about doing that?
yeah, absolutely. So on a like personal note, how it's helped me, I it's interesting because I sent that post out on like the 9th of February or whatever, and the activity was set to be in March. And immediately after I sent that out, my daughter got really sick, and we ended up at the hospital. She was in ICU for I think 12, how many days? I don't know, too many days. But she was in the hospital for about a month, and we left. She almost died. She was
Oof.
sedated for and on life support for a long time. We left with a cancer diagnosis. It was really horrible time. Um, and again, because of my conditioning and this core belief I had, my first response was, I did this. This is my fault. Like, I did this thing. It must be a terrible thing because look at this consequence that I got. Um, and I was actually I've shared this before in some settings, but a lot of people don't know. But that first activity, my daughter was still in the hospital. She was out of ICU. She was stable. She was doing a lot better. They were just kind of monitoring and helping with like different therapies to kind of get her ready to go home. But I had been living at the hospital for a month. And as it was coming close, I told my husband that I was like, I think I need to cancel this or like postpone it or something. And he said, no, I think you need to do it. Like, I'll go sit at the hospital tonight. You need to come home and do this. And so I came home and I put my jammies on and I put my smile on, and it was such an incredible night. And the amount of women that were like, thank you so much. I needed this. I needed this was so like helpful for me to hear, because in my mindset, I had done something terrible that caused something terrible. But in reality, like, I was helping these women who needed that space, who needed that community. And since then, I have had women, because we do scans all the time and things like that. And this community who like didn't even know me very well at the time, were showing up with meals. They were showing up with flowers. They were lifting me with no motive whatsoever. It was so incredible to be on the receiving end of that, to recognize what wonderful women these are. who are genuinely just good. They're just good and they just want to help. And that has helped me propel the group into what it is because I saw the potential it had for myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really powerful. And so I something I try to tell women is I have a lot who message me and are like, oh, I've been following you for a long time and I really want to come to an activity, but I'm scared or I'm nervous. And I just tell them, be brave. Like, just be brave. It's scary. It's scary as hell to put yourself out there or to like, especially when you come from an organization where your relationships are kind of forged for you, whether
Yeah.
it's in a calling or just in relief society. Um, it's hard to feel like you can be your authentic self without judgment, but you absolutely can in this group. Like the women that I have gotten so close to are so different. Every single one of them is so different and all come from different backgrounds and different political beliefs, but different like beliefs of all kind. They've taken different spiritual journeys, and it's just beautiful to see that though we all have something in common, which is we call it, we joke and call it our trauma bond, which is not necessarily a joke, but we all come from this high demand of religion, but that's not what keeps us together. It's the fact that these women are just good and they want to be part of your community. They want to.
Yeah.
And so for those who are interested, you can find me on Instagram. It's at the Relieved Society, period between each word. Or you can join the email list on the website that's listed there. And we get together once a month. It's very, very fun. We just did our second retreat, which was so much fun. We did like a breathwork healing journey. And it was, I told the girls after that it was just so fun to watch because I watched these women heal in so many different ways. Because it started off with, you know, this deep, intense breath work, which is like a form of hypnotherapy almost.
Yeah.
And it was heavy, it was hard, and these women were so vulnerable and letting it out. And then, you know, later during the weekend, they all dressed up in like the sluttiest outfits they could and were dancing and drinking and just having fun, letting loose in a way that they were never allowed to as young women, you know? And
Yeah.
it was just such a beautiful, normal thing for them to be doing, but you could see how healing it was for them to be able to, you know, dance and like nobody's watching, you know, and um, it's just such a beautiful community. We do so much in just terms of emotional and mental healing and just letting your authentic self out, however she presents herself, and it's been beautiful.
I will absolutely be linking everything in the show notes too for listeners for how they can follow you and connect with you and the Relieved Society. I What's coming up for me is just it really is this community of you're not alone. You said trauma bond, I giggled. But like it's you're not alone. And we're all different. And but we get to have this collective experience together to hold each other. And I think that's really powerful and so needed in the post-Mormon space. So thank you for that undertaking because I imagine it's a lot too.
It is, especially as it's grown, but I do have a lot of help now. Again, that's part of my conditioning of the fear of not doing it right. And so I sometimes like get worried about releasing control or like asking people for help because then I worry that that's going to be oh no, like I did something wrong. But that's been healing for me to be able to be like, oh no, I can ask for help, and that is not a bad thing. That's not a hard thing. But I'm realizing as I'm talking about my story and reliving some things that I started the Relieved Society because I desperately don't want anyone to ever feel like they weren't good enough, like they don't fit. I used that term a lot, is that I just felt like I didn't fit. And I firmly believe that you don't have to be a certain shape to fit. You don't have to have a certain background to fit. And I think we have that fear because growing up, we're taught to like surround yourself with the same kind of thoughts and beliefs and with the same kind of people. And so it can be daunting to go into a group where everybody's unique and everybody's different, because you think, oh, how am I going to connect with these people? You do. It's human nature. You will. You don't have to like the same things like we are taught that you do. You don't have to all drink. You don't have to drink. You don't have to do anything. You will find people and you will connect with them because of who they are as an individual. And that's so beautiful to watch and to partake in, to realize that, oh, I don't have to surround myself with all the same thing. Everybody can come as they are. They truly can. I can come as I am. I can be as authentic as I am, and I will still get embraced by somebody. And that's true for anybody who shows up. And it's beautiful to watch.
I'm just going to say amen, pun intended. No. But for real, I think that diversity is so incredibly healing. It's scary, but it is powerful.
It is.
I moved to Los Angeles when I was 18 from Utah to Los Angeles, Cedar City, Utah, and it was terrifying. It was like the most terrifying thing I've ever done. And I will say this, it saved my life because it took me out of this culture and it allowed me to be embraced by people who were different than me, who had different experiences, who were unique. Yeah. You know, and I think that's exactly what, like, as you're talking, that's the community you're building. Yeah. And that is so incredible. Okay. We've been talking for forever and I feel like we could keep going. I always do questions from submissions from the audience. Are you good to do a couple on time?
Yeah.
Okay. And I really like to have, I mean, I think Aubrey, you've lived so much of the Mormon experience in a lot of ways I haven't. And so I love to have guests on that can really speak to that. So we're going to start with the first submission. Seeking advice on how to shake the feelings of modesty, even after no longer wearing garments. I have been able to wear shorts that are obviously not garment friendly, but feel so uncomfortable in tank tops. Always worried I'll make someone real uncomfortable if I wear one. My mom has made comments saying if you feel uncomfortable, it's because you know you shouldn't be doing something.
Gotta love that manipulation. Thanks, Mom.
Yeah. I'm curious what was helpful for you.
So we kind of talked about how, like the testimonies, when you're constantly saying something over and over again, it becomes hardwired in your brain. Like literally it does. And so you're not weird for finding it hard to break a tradition that has been hardwired into your brain. When you are told that the world is black and white and your choices are good or bad, it's going to be really hard to choose this side when you've been conditioned that that's bad. And so what helped me is it's honestly retraining your brain. But what I have to remind myself is that the world is gray. The world is neutral. Choices most of the time are neutral. What we've been told is moral, like modesty. It's not good or bad. It's just gray. It's just neutral. And if you choose to wear a tank top, it's not a good decision. It's not a bad decision. It's just a decision. And you have to literally tell yourself that over and over again. Like I choose to wear this because I want to, not because I'm trying to be rebellious or because I'm doing something bad or something good. It's just a choice. And I choose to wear it because I like it. I choose to wear this because it looks good on me. I choose to wear it because it makes me feel good. It makes me feel empowered. And saying those things, which for me, I actually physically say things out loud because there's power in like giving words to the world and like speaking your truth, because that's what we did with our testimonies. And that's what we did in Young Women's, being constantly repeating our values over and over again, and speaking them out loud. We trained ourselves to believe that. So if you untrain yourself, you sometimes have to use the same methods. And so for me, like if I put on something that like I'm feeling weird about, I have to remind myself, oh, this is a neutral outfit. This is not good or bad, but I feel good in it. I like this color. I like this cut. It makes my shoulders look good, whatever. Tell yourself over and over again. And that's what's going to help rewire the brain to view it as a neutral choice rather than a bad choice.
Yeah. What a powerful way to put on clothes. Yeah. And I think too, there's so much of this that I like to think about when you're building these new skills or like creating these new pathways in your brain, it's almost like you're working out, like you're building that muscle.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to take time and practice. And it might just start with trying it on in the mirror and then not feeling ready to wear it out in the real world. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's really giving yourself permission to be curious and open to what this looks like. And it doesn't have to look a certain way. I also, whenever I see something like my mom has made comments, like the comments mom's made, I think for a lot of women that are in an oppressive culture or an oppressive purity culture around modesty, is that if you are wearing clothing that is quote unquote immodest according to that purity culture, you represent to a lot of women around you, in my opinion, the solution. Like what it means to be embodied and to wear what you feel comfortable in. And that is actually very distressing for those women. Not excusing moms like inappropriate comments, but it's almost, I think, what can be really helpful if you're worrying a lot about what other people think is to realize that you actually wearing what you want to wear and maybe activating other people is information for them to hopefully one day figure it out too.
Yes.
Right? Like hopefully mom can eventually maybe go there. Maybe she won't, but she's not going to go there if if you're not showing up authentically. But if you show up authentically and you work through that activation, you set an example and a precedent for all of the women around you that you can wear what you want to wear and feel good in it, you know?
Exactly.
And it's really helpful if you kind of just take the power back, whatever mom's feeling or any other woman or man have something to say about your clothing. That's their shit. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's their stuff coming up. It has nothing to do with you. And just really trying to reconnect to yourself and build your relationship with yourself. And it's easier said than done, but there's something incredibly empowering about being able to do it.
Absolutely. It's that same um, like rhetoric I use now when something feels icky to me. It's like, that does not serve me. So like if a comment is coming, like you said, it's coming from them. It's their own insecurities. It's their own feelings and biases. But that doesn't serve me. Thanks, but like that's not for me, you know?
Ah, and I think it's like their own, like whether it's conscious or unconscious, their own wish that they could do what you're doing.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
I mean, but again, it's very distressing because that's like their own unraveling they have to go through.
Right.
And most people don't want to go there. Okay, I want to do another question. Whenever I do something against the word of wisdom, drink coffee, etc., I still feel guilty after. Does this ever go away? I know I'm not a bad person, but I feel like such a bad person. My husband and kids are still active members. My husband asked me why I would want to throw my kids away after this life by drinking alcohol and coffee, yet he has a porn problem. I know the church isn't true and I never want to go back, but sometimes I feel like a horrible person for leaving and not living my life that way anymore. How do you navigate this? It's actually interesting, Aubrey, because I'm thinking like there's a part of this for me that's coming up and thinking about your story and and how you just never fit in and you had to keep going and you had to keep going until you are like, no.
Yes. Yes. And also feeling, I hear the husband kind of throwing in that guilt that it seems like she's maybe still feels, which is, are you throwing away your afterlife with your family by doing these minuscule things? And I relate to that a lot. I relate to that really big. But I think the key is coming down to where she says, I don't believe the church is true. So you don't believe you're throwing away your children. So that is something that you can release and let him have that. If he needs to hold on to that, that's him, for him to heal and for him to work through. You don't need to carry that for him. If you don't believe the church, you don't believe you're throwing away your children. You believe that you are providing a safe pathway for them if they end up on the same path as you, and that they will have a safer space than you did. So that when they do try their first sip of coffee, they're not going to feel like a terrible person. They can decide, hey, do I like this or do I not like this? Because that's what the choice should be. It should be, does this feel good to me right now? Does this feel like it is giving my body what it wants right now? And if the answer is yes, then it's still not a good choice or bad choice. It's just a choice. It's just a neutral choice. And if it serves you in that moment, great. If it doesn't, also great. But it just comes down to that. Like, it's a neutral choice, and you know what's right for you. You're raising your children the best you can. And it sounds like you deeply care about that. And your husband's shit is his shit, like you said.
Yep.
If he's carrying that, he can carry that on his own. That's not yours to carry for him.
Yeah, and also like the guilt that's coming up, I think when you're raised in this type of setting, guilt just starts to show up everywhere unnecessarily.
Yeah.
Like you should not have to feel guilty for having a cup of coffee or a glass of wine or whatever it may be, but that's so much a part of your conditioning. And so I think it's having grace for that too.
Yeah.
And for yourself that this, and it's kind of like when Aubrey was talking earlier too, that you're not just healed. And I think I see this a lot with people who are like, why can't I just get over this? Why can't I just not feel guilty anymore? And I mean, I wish it was that simple, and I wish I could give people a solution for that, but there isn't one. And you might feel guilty. And to me, can you be curious and open to that guilt versus judgmental? Like, I encourage you to do this. Like, imagine that you take a bird's eye view and you zoom out and you look at yourself and you look at your story, and you're raised in a high control religion and your husband's saying this shit. No wonder you feel guilty. It would be weird if you didn't feel that, and have compassion for that guilt versus judgment towards it, because it makes sense. And I think when we hold space for that emotion, we get to just move through it versus let it control and dictate us and get stuck, because it's probably going to show up again. Right? I mean, I would say, like for all of these things, and we've talked about it a lot today, but you're going to have pings. Your nervous system's going to get activated or triggered by things that you would think you've worked through.
Right.
But that's just not how it is. That's why we're always healing. And I think that includes this emotional experience.
Yeah, I agree completely.
All right. Lots of good stuff. Aubrey, thank you so much for coming on and sharing just so much of your life story. I'm like, I want to just keep going and keep asking all the questions. So I think that just means you'll have to come back one day.
Absolutely.
I ask all of my guests, is there anything, like any final words you want to share before we end? I know you already offered so much knowledge and wisdom, but if there's anything else.
No, just, I guess my final words of peace would be that you're worthy, and nothing takes that away. That is just inherent. That's something you have. You're good enough. You don't have to prove that to anybody, and especially not to a group that wants to hold space for you. Like, you have nothing to prove to anybody. Your worth is yours. And you're welcome with us at the Relief Society, and I hope you come and play.
Yeah, I cannot wait. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If today's content resonated with you, please share, leave a review, all the things. It would mean so much to me.